This is the bonus story to Wildwood in Winter. Copyright 2023, Bianca D'Arc. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Flying Home. After the mating party in Wyoming, Arlo couldn't wait to take his new bride home to his family. They weren't too far away as the crow flies, so flying Pam down to Vail, Colorado, didn't take long. The long part was explaining about his family and why he didn't live with them in the same pack. But he knew Pam would understand. She was his mate. They were destined to be together. So, once they were on the plane and headed toward the private airport outside Vail that one of his family members owned and operated, he tried to prepare her for what she would find at their destination. "My family is going to love you, but don't be surprised if you get a quieter reception than the one you got in Wyoming." Arlo broached the subject. Pam looked over at him. He was flying the small plane and she was sitting in the co-pilot seat. They both wore headsets so they could be heard over the noise of the engine. It was cozy in the small plane and he enjoyed flying. Pilot training had been part of his Special Forces education, and it was one of the areas he excelled at, which had come as a surprise. Before he joined the military, Arlo had never flown anywhere, but he soon came to enjoy it, especially when he was in control of his own aircraft. Why? Pam wasn't one to waste words. Her brows drew together in a small frown as she tried to puzzle out his statement. "After my sister was killed in that terrorist incident I told you about, my parents moved southward looking for a new start. But my father being my father, he had to do things his own way. Dad's never been one to do things small." Arlo sighed, thinking about his dad. "I mentioned to you that the pack I'd grown up in had disbanded, right?" When she nodded, he continued. "Well, that happened after my family moved away. They had been the glue holding the pack together, I guess. Dad owned quite a few of the businesses in town, and he sold up shortly after I joined the Army. There weren't enough wolves in the pack to buy all the businesses Dad owned, so some went to regular folks. More humans moving into the area meant less privacy for shifters, and a lot of the old-timers decided to move even farther north to get away from people. Once that started happening, the rest of the pack kind of disintegrated. Some moved south, following my family. An older alpha was in charge of my birth pack, and Dad had never challenged him for leadership out of respect, though Dad really was sort of the de facto alpha. He was the guy everybody came to for help, and he was more than happy to do what he could for anyone in the pack." "He sounds like a really nice man," Pam commented. Arlo nodded. "He is. And my mom is a genuine sweetheart. They're great people. But losing my sister in such a violent way changed everybody in my family. Dad got quieter. Mom withdrew into her art. And I have to admit, it's been a long time since I've seen my siblings." He knew he was going to have to tell her everything, even the stuff he tried hard not to think about. "My sister who died. Her name was Viola, an old-fashioned name picked to honor my great-grandmother on my mother's side. She was the nicest kid. Wicked smart, too. She was going to be a doctor. She had a big heart and loved helping people. It didn't surprise me at all that she died, protecting others in that shootout on her college campus. But losing her really hurt the family. Pack is pack, but family is even closer than that, if such a thing is possible. I couldn't handle it. I had planned to follow my father into business. Heck, I was already overseeing a couple of the shops in town for him when everything happened." "You mean you never intended to be a soldier?" Pam looked surprised. "Nope. I had some friends who went into the military, but I figured on following in my dad's footsteps. Then, when Viola died, that didn't make any sense to me anymore. I wanted to stop people like those who had killed my sister. That's why I went into the Army." They were silent a moment before Pam spoke again. "I can see how that would be a powerful motivation." Pam reached out and covered his hand with hers, offering comfort. She could probably see how hard this was for him to talk about. She was a good mate, a caring mate. He was so blessed to have her in his life. "So my dad, the business tycoon, moved everybody down to Vail. and decided to go into law enforcement. He shook his head. I mean, it's not as if it was new to him. You know how old I am. Dad's been around a lot longer than me. He was a sheriff in the old days, in the era they now call the Wild West. He and my mother were pioneers when people first started going west during the gold rush. Pam looked shocked, and then her eyes filled with wonder. I still can't believe how long shifters live. It's astounding to me to realize you were born around the turn of the last century. I must seem like such a child to you. He turned his hand over under hers so he could clasp her fingers gently. Not really. And remember, with all that dryad magic flowing through your veins, you'll probably live as long as I will. I still can't really believe that. She chuckled a little in disbelief. Time will tell, he counseled. So, did your dad duke it out with gunfighters like in the old movies? She teased. Sometimes, he allowed. But as a shifter, he was able to intercede with the Native Americans a lot more easily than anybody else. A lot of shifters tried their best to broker peace between the indigenous people and the newcomers, but we all know how that turned out. Not enough shifters, with not enough power back in the old days. At least that's what my dad always says. I think that's why he gave up law enforcement for so long and went into business. But I guess after what happened with Viola, he felt the need to go back into enforcement. There was an opening in Vail and a small pack that was willing to have him and the rest of the family join, and voila! New pack, new territory, new life. Something tells me it wasn't quite as easy as all that, Pam said knowingly. You're probably right. But I wasn't around for most of it. I was in the army, and then, after what I saw in foreign lands, I just couldn't go back home and be the person I had been before. I needed to be around other combat veterans who knew what we'd all been through. A bunch of us congregated around Jesse and formed the Wraiths. We didn't want to be out of the game entirely, but we wanted our work to be for the side of light. We couldn't always tell when we were in the military whether what we did was for the good of all or for some private agenda. Admiral Morrow is seeing to it now that shifter forces are being used only for those assignments that are strictly on the right side of things, but it wasn't always that way in the past. Admiral Morrow is Deke's father, right? Pam was still learning about all the distant family members she had gained by discovering her Dryad heritage. Her cousin Cecilia was mated to Deke Morrow, and they had spoken a few times by video, though they hadn't yet met in person. Yeah, Deke was an Army Green Beret, just like me. But his brothers, well, half-brothers actually, were both Navy SEALs, like the Admiral. Deke's biological father was human, and the Admiral is his stepfather. It's been a secret for a long time, but since the part Dryads have been discovered, and a few other things have been happening, it's become known that the Admiral and his two natural sons are water elementals, just like you have earth elemental magic, only theirs is a lot stronger because the Admiral is a full-blooded elemental power. With you and your cousins, there have been a lot of generations of other blood mixed in, diluting the Dryad's power. At least that's the theory. You still have a lot of magic in you, regardless. So, if there are earth and water elementals, are there also fire and air elementals? She asked. Indeed there are. You might even get to meet a few of them if we ever get time to visit Grizzly Cove. I've told you about that town, created by a bunch of my army friends who are bear shifters, right? I thought those guys were crazy when they started retiring and moving to the Washington coast, but they've really made it work, and magic seems to be drawn to that place. Originally, the idea was for it to be a place just for bear shifters, but it's turned into a whole lot more. I definitely want to go back there and see my friends and introduce you, of course. It's a beautiful town, and there's an entire mer pod living in the waters of the cove. He smiled at the memory of that picturesque place. You're kidding. Mer? As in mermaids? They're real? As real as you or me, he nodded. Some of them are pretty fierce fighters as well. They carry these long tridents that are wicked sharp and deadly. We helped them out with a little sea monster problem a couple of months ago, and they were a sight to behold. I can only imagine. She fell silent for a moment, then ground control broke in over the radio and Arlo had to answer. He'd gotten distracted, as he so often did when he talked with his mate. There was so much to tell her, so many years to fill her in on. They would have a lifetime together, and he knew they were only just starting out, but he wanted her to know everything about him all at once, impossible as that seemed. He only hoped he had given her enough warning about his family. The last time he had seen them, things had been very tense, to say the least. He still loved them, and he knew that they loved him as well. It had just gotten difficult to talk with them. Like none of them really had anything in common anymore. Stilted, estranged. Maybe that would no longer be the case. Maybe finding his mate would create some kind of bridge between his old life and his new one. He wasn't sure. As he'd told Pam, time would tell. Chapter 2. Vail, Colorado. Arlo landed the plane at the small private airport outside Vail that was owned and operated by his family. In fact, his younger brother was there to meet him when he taxied the small plane to a stop by the family hangar. He took a deep breath before opening the door and climbing down. Now it begins, he thought. Arlo helped Pam down from the plane and then turned to greet his little brother. Jethro. Arlo nodded to the young man, who had changed so much in the years since they'd last seen each other. Arlo wasn't altogether certain of his welcome. Arlo, it's good to see you, brother. The words, as well as the tone, told Arlo that his little brother wasn't holding grudges. He seemed willing to build the bridge between them that Arlo had burned with his family when he hadn't come back to them after leaving the service. Pam, this is my little brother, Jethro. Arlo made the introductions, hoping for the best. It's good to meet you, ma'am, Jethro offered, and Arlo started shaking his head, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Pam didn't like to be called ma'am. Arlo knew that all too well. I know you're being polite and all, but being called ma'am makes me feel older than Arlo actually is, Pam joked, and Arlo was glad to see his little brother was taking it in stride. Just call me Pam. We're family now. Jethro's face lit with pleasure. Jethro seemed so young and innocent compared to how Arlo felt. He was only in his late teens, after all. He hadn't even met Viola. Jethro had been born a few years after she was killed, and Arlo hadn't really been home much except for the occasional visit while this kid was growing up. They were brothers, but they barely knew each other. Arlo hoped to rectify that if this family gave him the chance. Dad sent me to pick you up, Jethro told them. Mom's got everybody gathered. I hope you're in the mood for a party. It feels like we've been doing nothing but celebrating for the last few days, Pam said, as Arlo retrieved their overnight bags from the luggage compartment of the plane. Jethro helped carry the stuff to the big SUV he had parked just outside the hangar door. That's what happens when people get mated, Jethro told her easily. It's good for the pack. It makes all of us cheerful, and we want to join in the happiness of the newly mated couple. Any excuse to party, am I right? Jethro smiled with the enthusiasm of youth, and Pam laughed along with him, agreeing without words. Arlo opened the door of the SUV and helped Pam up. This was one of the big four-wheel drive vehicles Arlo's dad had always favored. It was good to see some things never changed. Once they were on the road, it didn't take long to get to the family home. The Vail pack lived in one of the more rugged areas on the side of a mountain not inundated with skiers and all their paraphernalia, but still close enough to get to the tourist spots and the town. It was a unique situation for a shifter community. There was no doubt that Vail was a human hotspot for skiers and rich folks who wanted a place in the mountains, but there were also wild spots that no human could access, even on skis. Those were the places the wolves were able to run free. That's where his family's pack lived, and thrived by all accounts. His parents' house was a lot bigger than the one he had grown up in farther north. It was much more luxurious as well, in keeping with the human inhabitants of the area. A big house for an important family. And after selling all his businesses and all the time he'd had to store away all the profits of those businesses, his father could more than afford this nice mansion on the side of the mountain. That's some house, Pam said as the pillared front door came into view. "It doubles as a pack house sometimes," Jethro offered. "There's a lot of room for guests, and ever since Dad took over as Alpha, people come to him with all sorts of problems he never had to deal with before." That was interesting, Arlo thought. You mean more than just law enforcement type stuff, right? I mean, he always dealt with that in the old days. "Oh yeah," Jethro answered right away. "Now he has to deal with all sorts of other stuff. Mom actually does most of that. Dad calls her an intuitive social worker." Jethro chuckled a little. "Mom deals with all the logistics when people are renovating, or if there's some sort of catastrophe in someone's house that needs to be fixed before they can live there again. All the little things that Pat can help with." Arlo hadn't been at home when his father took over as Alpha of the Vale Pack and the previous Alpha's death. The Vale Pack had been led by a very old werewolf who had commanded respect from everyone in the area. He had picked Arlo's dad to succeed him when they had first moved to the area. That decision had raised a few eyebrows among people who had lived there a lot longer, but over the years the rest of the pack had come to see the wisdom in the old Alpha's decision. By the time the old man had died, Arlo's dad had been firmly entrenched in his new role and widely accepted by everyone in the pack. Jethro pulled the SUV up in front of the door and parked. He hopped out and immediately went for the luggage while Arlo helped Pam down from the high vehicle. Before her feet were even on the ground, the front door flew open and Arlo's mother came down the steps, tears of joy on her face. She ran right up to Arlo and put her arms around him. There was no question in Arlo's mind as to whether or not his mother would welcome him home. As usual, his mother wore her heart on her sleeve and hugged him like she would never let go. Of course she had to, especially if she wanted to meet her new daughter-in-law. "Arlo, my boy," his mother said as she drew back to look at his face. "You look good, son. Happier than I've seen you in a long, long time. And I suppose he has you to thank for that," she said, turning her attention to Pam, who stood at Arlo's side. "Mom, this is my mate, Pam." That was all it took. His mother reached for Pam and gave her a big hug, welcoming her to the family in a quavering voice filled with emotion. Arlo saw his father coming out of the house a little more slowly, walking down the steps. Their eyes met, and Arlo nodded in respect. His father nodded back. That was the old man. He never gave an inch. "Good to have you home, son." That simple sentence allayed all of Arlo's fears. His father had welcomed him, and that meant everything. "Good to be home, Dad." He turned to look at his mother, who had finally let go of Pam and made the introductions. "Dad, this is Pam. She's my mate." The declaration felt good. Arlo would probably never tire of proclaiming that Pam was his and his alone, just as he was hers. "Welcome to the family, Pam. I'm very pleased to see Arlo looking so happy. It's clear you're a good match for him, and I hope you won't mind explaining a little bit about your dryad powers. It's been a long time since I've come across an earth elemental." Arlo's dad shocked him with his speech. "How do you know so much about Pam's background?" Arlo smiled as he asked, though his words were a bit challenging. Arlo's dad grinned and winked at her. "I have my sources. You don't spend as long as I have in law enforcement without learning how to investigate. And just so's you know, everything I've learned so far about you two has made me very happy." Sheriff Zachariah Makepeace happy. Arlo could hardly comprehend it. His father had always been such a serious man. It seemed living here in Colorado had been very good for the old man. Chapter 3. Meeting the Vale Pack. They all trooped inside where, true to Jethro's words, it looked like a real party was going on. The house was filled with people, all eating and drinking and chatting. The minute Arlo and Pam stepped through the doorway, a cheer went up from everyone gathered. Arlo had a good time introducing Pam around to everyone he knew, including members of his extended family, his aunts and uncles and cousins, the others who had come with his family when they left the pack up north and moved to Vale. They had joined the Vale Pack, which had been aging and not attracting new members for a long time, and revitalized it with their presence. The Vale Pack had undergone a revolution since his family had joined it, and they were now a vital part of the local economy and gaining strength and recognition in the wider magical world. Arlo was so proud of them and all they had built here. He still couldn't come home, though. He'd made his life with the Wraiths, and he felt needed there. Of course, if his mate wanted to move, he would do it in a heartbeat. But since 2 of her newfound cousins were already mated into the Wyoming pack, he had a feeling she'd want to stay with them for a while. He was just as happy to remain with the Wraiths, though he'd take a less combative role now that he was mated. There was no sense in taking unnecessary risks and losing all that he'd just gained. Pam was amazed by the open-hearted welcome from Arlo's family. His parents were sweethearts, though his father was a bit scary at first. He had those alpha vibes, just like his son, but he'd had a lot longer to perfect his penetrating gaze. She sensed a bit of tension at first between Arlo and his family, but it seemed to dissipate like smoke on the breeze as soon as he talked to each new person. They were family, after all, and they loved him. It was easy enough for her to see because she loved him too. "Do you ski, Pam?" one of the cousins asked her as they handed her a glass of wine they'd procured for her. "A little. My father worked on a project in Switzerland when I was a young teen, and I learned to ski that winter in the Alps," she admitted. She saw the confusion on their faces and elaborated a bit. She didn't often have a chance to talk about her family, and she found she liked it, especially when she was talking to people who actually cared. "My father was a civil engineer. After my mother died, he moved us around a lot, following the various projects he worked on. We mostly lived in the States, but we did spend one winter in Switzerland and a summer in Japan. His last project was in Boise, so that's where I stayed after he died." She could feel the compassion coming off the cousins as she told them her story. One of the women reached out and touched her arm, her expression sympathetic. "Is that where you met Arlo?" one of the ladies asked, her eyes kind as she looked from Pam to where Arlo stood a few feet away talking to some others. "Oh no, I moved from Boise a few years ago when an elderly neighbor left me her cabin in the woods. Arlo came to find me because my cousins were looking for more of the extended family, and my name turned up in their search. As it happens, some very bad people had discovered my location, and Arlo saved my life." "How romantic!" one of the ladies exclaimed. Pam felt Arlo come up beside her, and he placed one arm around her waist. She smiled up at him, always happy when he was near. "She saved my life first," he countered with a grin as he looked deep into her eyes. "I think we can agree that we saved each other. And Sir Cameron saved both of us that first time," she added, to be fair. "Sir Cameron?" one of the older ladies asked in a penetrating voice, recalling Pam to the fact that they had a very large audience watching them. A well-intentioned audience, but an audience nonetheless. "A Fey knight answered my mate's prayer. He is sworn to the goddess, and he has some amazing magic at his disposal. I think we both would have been goners if not for him that first time, at the very least. He helped in the final battle, too. He really was central to our survival in this last adventure," Arlo admitted, shaking his head. "You're mated now," Arlo's dad said, joining the group that had gathered around them. "You can't be taking such big chances anymore. I hope you realize that." Arlo nodded. "I've already made plans with Jesse to do what he did when he mated and take a step back from the Wraiths. There are other men, single men, better suited to taking risks in the field that are no longer tolerable for me as a mated man." Arlo sounded a bit smug as he said that last bit, but Pam allowed him his pride. She felt the same every time she realized that he was her husband. Damn, she was one lucky, blessed girl. "Will you be coming home then?" the older lady wanted to know. Arlo shook his head. "We haven't talked about this yet, but 2 of Pam's cousins are mated into the Wyoming pack, and there's still good work I can do there behind the scenes, with the Wraiths. I'm still their executive officer," Arlo said, then looked at Pam. "I only just met my cousins," Pam explained. "None of us knew about each other until recently, and I'd like to discover more about my Dryad heritage. So for now, I'd like to stay in Wyoming. But when my cabin in Idaho is safe again, you're all welcome to visit. I think Arlo and I are going to use it as a vacation home." "Well, I hope you'll spend some time visiting us as well," Arlo's mother put in as she brought out a tray of snacks to the circle and passed them around. "Absolutely," Pam assured her. "You've all been so nice to welcome me. Of course we'll visit whenever we can." Chapter 4. A Weekend at the Makepeace Mansion. They spent the weekend in one of the guest rooms in the Makepeace Mansion. To call it a house wasn't truly accurate. It was huge, bigger than the pack house in Wyoming even. They'd arrived on a Friday and enjoyed the great welcome party. On Saturday, Arlo showed Pam around the town, where she was pleased to discover that many of his cousins and other members of the Vale Pack were employed in the shops. Some worked for his father as deputies, some told her they spent winters on the ski patrol, and more than a few owned businesses in town. They all greeted Arlo and Pam warmly as they crossed paths. Arlo and Pam had dinner that night back at the mansion. Then on Sunday they spent the morning with Arlo's immediate family before they headed for the airstrip. This time, everybody piled into their vehicles to go to the airport and see them off. In fact, Arlo's mom had arranged a sort of farewell party in the hangar. Pack members had set up tables and brought all kinds of food for a buffet lunch. Pam was both surprised and delighted by this. Arlo's family and their new pack had really gone all out to make her feel welcome, and to welcome back their long-lost son. As far as she was concerned, they were all wonderful. At one point during the luncheon, Arlo's mother took Pam off to one side so they could talk. Pam really liked the older lady, finding it easy to like someone who loved Arlo so obviously and so well. "I just wanted to say thank you for coming all the way here so we could meet you," Arlo's mother told Pam, speaking in a low voice. "No need to thank me," Pam insisted. "I'm just glad Arlo wanted to share you all with me. I've been on my own with no family that I knew of for a very long time, and suddenly I have not only all my Dryad cousins, but now Arlo's family. It's—" Pam got choked up, realizing how very blessed she'd become. She cleared her throat before she was able to continue. "I didn't like to think about it, but I've been very lonely these past few years," she admitted. Arlo's mom reached over to pat Pam's hand. She was such a comforting presence. "You're Pack now," she said. "Pack means you'll never be lonely again. We are your family. We will always welcome you and Arlo. I hope he knows that." The older woman looked over at her son with a pained expression. "I don't suppose he's told you about Viola." It was Pam's turn to be understanding. "He has," Pam said quietly. Her loss still affects him deeply. "As it does all of us," Arlo's mom confirmed, nodding. "We moved lock, stock, and barrel and forged a new life for all of us here, but not a day goes by that I don't think of my beloved Viola." Pam reached out, boldly taking the initiative to comfort the older woman. "I know what it's like to lose those you love. The pain never leaves you completely," Pam said softly. "It never does. You're right about that, my dear," Arlo's mother replied, meeting Pam's gaze. "I hope you'll feel free to call me Mom, like my other children do, or Ruth Ann if that's more comfortable for you." "Ruth Ann? What a lovely name," Pam enthused, feeling almost overwhelmed by emotion as this kind, kind woman accepted her so freely. "I'm honored, Ruth Ann." Tears were starting behind her eyes again, but Pam tried to hold them back. She had gained so much in such a short time. The very idea of never being alone again was earth-shattering to her. She'd gotten so used to going it alone. Used to it, but not really happy about it. She just hadn't seen a way to get out there and meet people she could trust with her heart. These people, though. These people had claimed a little part of her heart without even trying, and she knew deep down in her soul that they would never knowingly hurt her. These were the kind of good people one was privileged to find only rarely in life, and here she'd found 2 whole wolf packs full of absolutely wonderful folks who were willing to accept her as part of their extended family. "You've made my Arlo the happiest of men," Ruth Ann went on speaking while Pam tried to process all that had happened in such a short time. "I wasn't sure he'd ever come home again, but now, with you in his life, I have hope he will at last find some peace." "More than that," Pam promised Ruth Ann. "I want him to find joy and laughter again. I know I haven't known him long, but he seems happier and more relaxed now that he's come home. He sort of warned me that we might not get the warmest of receptions, but I was glad to see he was totally wrong on that score." Pam felt like Ruth Ann needed to know what her son had been thinking. There had been too little communication between Arlo and his parents for too long. "I can't believe he thought that." Ruth Ann looked scandalized. "I'm glad you told me, Pam." Ruth Ann patted Pam's arm. "That boy takes too much after his father, I've always said. The strong, silent type. His father can't really get away with that with me because of the mate bond, but Arlo is another story. I'm so glad he has you in his life to balance him out." Ruth Ann moved closer, putting one arm around Pam's shoulders, hugging her to her side. "And I'm so glad he brought you into our family. I hope you won't mind if I consider you my daughter. That's the way it is with shifter families." Pam felt joy in her heart at Ruth Ann's words. "Then I consider myself doubly blessed. I'm only sorry I can't shift and join you all when you run." Ruth Ann chuckled and Pam joined in. "That's okay. From what I hear, you can do some pretty amazing things on your own. Even if you weren't magical, I'd still rejoice in your joining our family. That's one of the nicest things anyone has ever said to me." Pam turned to meet Ruth Ann's gaze. "Thank you, Mom." They hugged and laughed and cried for a few moments until Arlo came over to split them up. "What's all this?" he asked, putting his arms around them from the side. "Group hug?" "Oh, you're incorrigible," Ruth Ann chided her son, reaching up to pull his head down for a quick kiss on the cheek before letting everybody go. "I was just welcoming your mate into our family," Ruth Ann explained, "and encouraging her to make you fly her here more often. I haven't seen you enough, my boy, and now I have a new daughter to get to know. I hope she'll consent to help me with my garden this spring." "Of course I will," Pam replied at once, smiling. "I love gardening." "She's especially good with trees, Mom." Arlo put his arms around Pam from behind and hugged her to his chest, looking at his mother over the top of Pam's head. "That's what dryads do best, from what I've been able to learn. The moment I heard you'd made it a woman with dryad blood, I started doing a little research. I don't think we've ever had an elemental power in the family before," Ruth Ann enthused. "I think you're going to be a great addition, Pam. I can already see how happy you make my son." "He makes me happy, too," Pam admitted. Chapter 5. A Fond Farewell. They spent an hour or two at the buffet lunch, but eventually they had to get in the air in order to get back to Wyoming while it was still light enough to see the airstrip. Arlo took his leave of his family with a much lighter heart than when he'd arrived. They'd been wonderful and really accepting of both him and his new mate. All his worrying had been for naught. "That went much better than I expected," Arlo told Pam as they winged their way home. "You shouldn't have worried. Your family is terrific," Pam said, smiling happily at him from the co-pilot's chair. "They missed you, Arlo." She paused to meet his gaze. "They really love you." He felt the truth of her words. He'd had his doubts, but this visit had reminded him that he really did have a family besides the men he'd served with and been through hell with. The Wraiths were a different kind of family. Their bonds had been forged by the horrors of war and facing death together, sometimes on a daily basis. But the bonds with his family went deeper still, and he'd been foolish to think that they'd weaken with time. "I love them too," Arlo admitted. "Almost as much as I love you, Pam. Thanks for taking the weekend away from your newfound cousins to meet my folks. This trip was a turning point, I think. A really good one. and I have you to thank for it." "Don't be silly," she said, smiling to soften her words. "We have so many people who love us and want the best for us. We have an embarrassment of riches where family is concerned. It's going to be our job to make sure we keep up with them all and be certain they all know how much we love them in return." "I like that idea," he replied, grinning. He could just picture flying between Wyoming and Colorado whenever he wanted to see his folks. Having this little plane at his disposal was going to come in really handy. "I do too. Lots of family, lots of love, lots of people caring about us and for us to care about. We're not alone anymore, Arlo. Even if you were surrounded by the wraiths, I suspect there was always the air of the lone wolf about you. I think that's dissipated now." "No more lone wolf for either of us," he nodded in agreement. "From now on, we're a team, you and me, with a whole lot of friends and family behind us. Deal?" "Absolutely," she answered with a wide grin. Arlo felt it then, the way things were going to be from now on. The two of them flying through life side by side. Judging by the past few days, it was going to be glorious. Thanks for listening to the bonus story to Wildwood in Winter by Bianca D'Arc. The next book in the series is called The Elven Star and will be out shortly. Be sure to check Bianca's website at www.biancadarc, that's BIANCADARC.com, for more updates and information on all her series. Thanks for listening.